My dad's been running for over 55 years, and after the last video, everyone was like, we need more from your dad. So today, I'm going to share with you the 6 things that my dad has taught me over the years that can help you improve your running. The first lesson my dad ever taught me was that you can never make up enough time in the first half that you'll lose in the second half if you go out too fast. And really what that means is that if you do not pace yourself correctly and you go out too hard, you cannot bank enough time to save it for the second half, because you will lose more time in the second half than you've banked in the first half. And here is Devlin to explain to you why that is so important.
So the reason you blow up in a race if you go out too hard in the first half is twofold. Firstly, I'm going to dive into a little bit of physiology around why this can happen. Now, there are 2 energy systems in particular that your body uses and that we train, and this is also why your training becomes quite important. Those are an anaerobic metabolism and an aerobic metabolism. Now, anaerobic metabolism generally means in the absence of oxygen, so you don't have oxygen to help your body supply energy for the demand of what it's needed. And as a fuel source, this relies heavily on carbohydrates. The converse to that is the aerobic energy metabolism, and that is in the presence of oxygen. And what that does is we then require carbohydrates as a fuel source, as well as ketones and fats to provide the energy to the muscles required. Now, just to also let you know, nothing works in isolation in the body. We are always using both energy systems to some degree. It's not an on-off switch. However, your anaerobic metabolism only has about 30 to 40 minutes at intensity worth of stores that the body can supply energy for what the demand of the particular activity is. So you can imagine now, if you are racing too close to that anaerobic threshold line, that we are now putting so much strain on the body that the body starts to deplete quite quickly its fuel sources, and then relies on falling more heavily into the aerobic metabolism. Now, this is where the training becomes quite important, and we talk about training at lower intensities, more aerobic base that you probably would have heard of. If you are training too close to an anaerobic line, what tends to happen is your aerobic line or your aerobic threshold starts to decrease, or it actually degenerates a little bit. So you're training too hard, you're racing everything too hard, and your aerobic line starts to drop, and we call that, or we refer to that as your lowest common denominator. Now, in a race, if you go out too hard and you're running too close to that threshold line, after that 30 to 40 minutes of depleting the energy, you are then going to drop down to that aerobic metabolism, or that lowest common denominator. Now, you can imagine that is probably going to be, if it's depleted, it's going to drop quite low, and you are actually going to be much slower than what you would have been as if you had just started that race a little bit slower and sticking to not an easy run, but at a slightly slower pace, that you weren't pushing that threshold going too fast in the first half of the race. The second component as to why this can happen, or that blow up can happen, is a strength training component. Now, a lot of us tend to neglect strength training, and it is really important because it is preparing your body to handle the kind of stresses and the kind of loads that not only training will help in the training volume, but the intensity of racing. If your body is stronger, there's more power, it uses less energy because you're stronger, your muscles know how to handle those kinds of intensities. So it means you can sustain that intensity for a little bit longer, and it also means you are not going to break down and feel that pain and that fatigue as quickly in a race. It might help if I throw a couple of numbers at you, because this could almost be a little bit of a fear factor. If you go out, in particular in half marathons or longer, if you go out too hard, every minute that you go out too hard or too close to that anaerobic threshold line, you can lose up to 4 to 8 minutes in the second half of your race. So again, just think about that for a second. For every minute in the first half that you go out too hard, you can lose 4 to 8 minutes in the second half of the race. That is a massive blow up, where if you had just started a little bit slower, not trying to bank time in the beginning of the race, it pays off later on where you don't have this massive decline. Starting a little bit slower, you think you might be losing time. I can tell you now, the benefit or the gains from starting a little bit slower in a race and finishing strong far outweighs the risk of you blowing up towards the end of that race and actually having an absolute nightmare on race day.
The second thing is that my dad taught me that we train to race and we don't race to train. And that was really a lesson that he had learned from reading Arthur Lydiard. Arthur Lydiard used to say, we train, we don't strain. And so essentially what my dad was teaching me there was that you don't give everything in training, and you need to do the appropriate types of training and then to perform to your best on race day. And the best example that I have of this is that because of my dad having taught me that lesson, whenever we used to train in our training group at school, I was never at the front of the train. In fact, I was very often near the back of the train. And every single athletic season, all the rumors would start in the school that Lindsey was finally going to get beaten at athletics. And the one year in particular, when I was about 12 years old, rumors were rife that I was going to get taken out in the 1,200 meters because I was finishing so far behind in all the training sessions. But when the inter-house competition happened on the Saturday, I came first and in fact lapped the second athlete on my last lap. And that was really because I always trained at where I was supposed to be in training to prepare for race day. And Tutu is going to explain to you why it is so important to train properly to prepare for a race.
So you might have heard these two statements before through running media, that the idea of train, don't strain, or you train to race, not race to train. So the important thing about these statements and why they're good philosophies to adapt to your training is that the train, don't strain part is this idea that we can't go out and smash all of our runs. Much of our training, we talk about the 80-20 principle, much of our training has got to be easy. And you're building up endurance and strength to allow you to do that little 20% of training that's actually going to be your race-specific training. And this idea of like you train to race and not race to train, often people go out and they use races to build fitness. So you do 2 or 3 days in the week and you go smash a 5K or a 10K or a half marathon on the weekend. You can't build up fitness if you're constantly going out, training for a little bit and running races, training a little bit and running races. So you actually need to go out and build a nice block of training. So building all that training that you're doing, and the sum total of your training is going to help you achieve your goals at the end. And so if you're aiming to run, a sub 4 hour marathon, a sub 40 10K, or whatever it might be, you need to put in the time, the training, for you to be able to build the required fitness for you to nail your race as best you can on race day.
The third lesson my dad taught me was to always warm up properly. And I remember my dad and I running along and him telling me how important it is to warm up properly so that you can be ready to go from the time the gun goes. And me explaining to him that, you know what, Dad, I'm always worried that if I warm up, I'm going to be using some of my energy up for the end of the race. I remember my dad telling me that if you can't finish off the race because of a warm-up, then you simply are not fit enough. And this is another one of those great things that led into a particular athletics meet that I was at. And my dad had shown me some warm-up exercises to do after we'd had this discussion, and I was in the middle of the field doing the exercises when the athletics coach came up to me and said, "What are you doing? You are just going to make yourself tired for the race." And I tried to politely explain to her that my dad was a very good runner and that he had helped me to put this warm-up routine together, and needless to say that that race was my best race of the season up to that point because I had warmed up properly. And now we're going to send you over to Shona to explain to you what happens when you warm up.
Awesome. Thank you, Linz, for that. So why is warming up so important, right? So it's definitely not about your fitness, as Lindsey has just said. It's really about preparing your body for what your body is about to do, right? So we want to get an increase in heart rate so that the blood is pumping around or circulating around your system a lot quicker. That means more oxygen to your cells and so on. And so that increase in heart rate is the first aspect of what we're looking for from a warm-up. The second part is to really start getting the joints and the limbs mobile so that they are ready to do what we're asking them to do in our races. And so a couple of leg swings, moving through some dynamic movements, limbering up the joints a little bit is really going to go a long way in helping you achieve your goals and your results. And lastly, it's a mental and touches on a bit of a neural aspect. We want to get that neural pathway from the brain to the muscles waking up and firing. We want to make sure that the muscles are alive and good to go. And that last part, as I say, is a mental aspect. Really, a lot of athletes use their warm-up as a time to get focused, as a time to get in the zone, think about what you're doing, visualize what you're about to do, so that when the gun goes, you are absolutely ready to go.
So the fourth point is more of a lesson that my dad taught me through a story that he told me about when he first got to Wits University in South Africa. And my dad was obviously a gifted runner always, but he had never trained properly. And so he arrived at Wits University and found out about this running group, and the guys tagged him along, and off they went for what would turn out to be one of his first 20-mile training runs. Off they went in the dark, trotting along, and my dad got quite bored and was like, "What is this? I mean, you can't run this slowly." And he tore off, asked the guys where to go, told them he'd see them at the end. And well, quite a while before the end, they found my dad at a local fueling station, a petrol station, begging for a Coke from the little shop at the petrol station because he was absolutely finished. And so that is where my dad learnt to pace himself really well on training runs, and that is a lesson that he has passed down to me. And one of the things that my dad has taught me extremely well is how to pace myself perfectly across a variety of workouts.
So this is a very important lesson to learn. Getting your training intensities dialed in right for you. I want to just repeat the for you part. An easy run, for example, for your mate might not be the same as your easy run. That is all relative, and intensity in training is relative. So, how do we do this? How do we refer to this and implement it? Now, you may have heard the 80-20 rule in terms of polarized training. So 80% of your training should be light, easy intensity, and 20% should be higher intensity. Those numbers do also change. We often more beginner type runners, slightly slower runners, and even older runners, we would generally recommend going maybe even closer to 90% easy and 10% of higher intensity. But what is important though is determining what those intensities, training paces, heart rates are for you. There's different ways of doing that, doing things like time trials, doing threshold tests, determining percentages of your threshold or what you can sustain at a higher intensity. Percentages of that then determine what your easy or long run pace should be, as well as what your interval training run should be as well. So getting those pacings right, getting those intensities right, do allow you to train well, to recover well, and make sure that those paces and intensities are right for you to allow you to benefit in your training and ultimately implement the best race plan that you can have later down the line.
The fifth lesson my dad taught me, which I unfortunately didn't heed, was how important flexibility is. And I remember watching my dad trying to touch his knees and laughing at him, and he would tell me that it's very important that I stretch, and I stretch now, and I continue to stretch as I get older. Otherwise, I'm going to be the same as him, and I'm not going to be able to touch the ground without sitting down first. Unfortunately, I didn't take heed, and genetics have taken over, and so now I struggle to touch my knees. So make sure you take advantage of my dad's lesson. Take heed, work on your flexibility now, and Devlin is going to talk you through how to do that.
Flexibility and mobility is a big area that most runners actually tend to neglect. So there is just a difference between flexibility and mobility. So flexibility is a little bit more how supple you are around your tendons, your ligaments, your muscles, and how far, for example, you can reach down to your toes. And mobility is really about the range of motion around the joints, how you can get full ranges, in particular around things like your hips, your knees, your ankles, and so on. And that's where it becomes really important for running. If we can be more flexible and more mobile, again, how mobile we can be, that really does eliminate a lot of the risks that we have of getting injured. You have more range, you're not quite as tight, your body's not pulling in various directions, and it means you can run better. It actually improves your running performance. You can actually run a little bit faster. The better mobility you have, your recovery is a lot better. You're not feeling as sore and stiff and tight the next day as well. So just getting your mobility and your flexibility right and implementing that in your daily sessions. So even if you've got a rest day, doing some light mobility work and flexibility work is a really good habit to get into, and this can be implemented on a daily basis. I do recommend though, keep in mind there is a limit to flexibility. You can be over flexible or hyper flexible, and the problem with that then just means a bit of laxity around some of your joints that then can lead to injury. So just be cautious around that. There is a risk to being too flexible, but in most cases I can tell you now, we probably neglect the flexibility and mobility side of things enough that we're not really at risk of that for the general population. So implement flexibility and mobility routines to your training plan, and it will help your running down the line.
The sixth lesson pertains specifically to ultra running. I had spent years trying to nail the Comrades marathon. My father's got 3 gold medals, 20 something silver medals, and I at this point had no silver medals. And although I could get within 1 second of any other race, up to 33 miles, 56 kilometers at the Two Oceans Marathon, I could get within 1 second of my predicted time. I was way out with Comrades, and I was on a run with my dad. I was complaining to him about how I cannot get Comrades right. It doesn't matter how I train, if I spend more time doing speed work, more time doing hill work, more time doing long runs, I got to the same place every time, and I was just too sore to be able to run, and Comrades just isn't for me. And my dad was like, oh, like where does that happen? And I was like, yeah, almost always with 20 Ks to go. And my dad, in a fairly unsympathetic manner, said, oh, we always used to say that if you were only sore for the last 20 Ks of Comrades, that you'd had a great run. And if you were sore for 30 Ks, you'd had an okay run, and being sore for more than 30 Ks meant that you'd had a bit of a disaster. And that flicked a switch in my head. And since then, I've expected to get sore with 20 Ks to go, knowing that I have prepared well for Comrades. And ever since that day, I have run silvers every time I've run Comrades. And so the lesson for you is that in ultra running, you are going to get to points where you are in discomfort and sore, and that is the nature of ultra distance running. But when that time comes, if you just carry on running, you will realize that the pain, A, doesn't progress, and B, that you are able to maintain exactly the same speed for a fairly long time running in that discomfort. The reality is that as we go longer, or as we try and get faster, running remains hard. This video will help you navigate that.